Welcome
to the Expert
PK
and Newbie podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Expert PK and Newbie podcast, the podcast where each week we take a passage of the Bible, we read it together, and we get the different perspectives from three different people. Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
As always, I've got Morgan Carter, I've got Lachlan Miller, and I've got myself, Joshua Lee. How are you going, everyone?
Well,
Well,
in the last few days, I got to see both my family and Em's family and have a good time. And then just yesterday, I spent the entire afternoon just wrapping my head around the minor prophets because I'm going to be doing a Bible study series on that at church. And sometimes it blows my mind that that is my job. That I just get to spend an afternoon trying to understand what is going on in the Bible, and that's a work day.
yeah, I mean, you get to do it for your actual job. You get to do it for here.
And also on the podcast.
Yeah,
It's great.
It's your entire life.
I'm doing really well, Josh.
Oh, good.
Morgan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I've got my friend staying with her little daughter at the moment, and we've got one of our best friends' weddings next weekend. So a bit chaotic at the moment, just getting things done, but exciting time. Keeping me on my feet. Yeah.
Definitely.
Nice to look forward to.
What about you, Josh?
Good, yeah. No, it's been well. It's been a good week with different things coming up. But looking forward to sort of the week coming out because I've going down to Canberra for a working job, and I always like to sort of the jobs where you get to travel. It's almost like a little bit of a working holiday, though you are working. So if you get swamped with that sort of work, then it's not really a holiday, but it's nice to sort of to travel, especially when we've just been stuck in the one place. It's nice to travel. So I'm looking forward to going down to Canberra. Hopefully it'll be a bit cooler down that way, and escape the Sydney heat. But yeah, no, I'm doing well.
Nice.
Morgan, which chapters are we doing today?
So today we're reading from halfway through chapter 6 to the end of chapter 9 in Genesis.
Today's passage comes from the book of Genesis, starting in the second half of chapter 6 until the end of chapter 9. These chapters focus on the story of a worldwide flood and how Noah and his immediate family are rescued from this flood by the construction of an ark. While the flood cleanses the world of human wickedness, the ending of the story shows that human nature is still corrupt and directed towards evil.
So to briefly recap last episode, we had Cain and Abel, we had the first murder, and then we just saw the slow spiraling descent of mankind into sinfulness. And we ended halfway through chapter 6 with God regretting that he had made mankind because of how evil and violent they had become on the earth. And then we said that God, in our next episode, was going to do some type of solution to this problem. And here we are today with the story of Noah and the flood.
So between last episode finishing that and sitting on that thought, I was thinking all week, why were people created like that? If he had all the power to create these great divine people, why didn't he create them not to turn evil?
Well, he gave us free will, and if God was to sort of take away that free will, then we're sort of just become like robots, certain him just sort of puppeting us around. And so my sort of answer to that would be, well, with free will, we have the choice to sin or not sin. And as a result, we decided to sin. We may have been slightly manipulated in the process, but it was still our choice to do it. So I think God could just take away it all, but then that takes away sort of our free will, our choice to do it. So I think it probably stems around that. It was our choice to sin, and it's and it was their choice to sort of become corrupt and sort of go down this path.
Sounds like a great answer to me, Josh.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I just think like he was so sure on what he wanted and the directions and what everything was really ordered and like to perfection. I just thought if it's gone so bad and so evil, why was that allowed to happen? But yeah, that makes sense saying it like that.
Yeah, and I think this would have broken God's heart. Like this would have been devastating to sort of witness, especially when you're saying, Morgan, about, this was like, his plan, his creation, everything wanting to be sort of quote unquote perfect and divine, like you said. And it'd be like your own kids going down a path that you don't want them to do, it break your heart. But like a parent, you almost have to either trust them or trust that they'll come back around to you, or whatever that dynamic might look like,
or intervene strictly,
or intervene. In this case, it's quite a drastic thing that's sort of about to happen, which sort of tells us how dire the situation was. Yeah, to sort of regret the decision and then go, okay, we're going to wipe out everyone except for one family and we're going to start over. It's interesting that it's wipe out everyone except for one family. God, as we saw before, created humans, so he could just wipe everyone out and sort of restart the process again. But he's sort of seen this righteous man, this person that's been walking with God, has this fellowship with God. So he sort of chooses Noah to sort of lead the next stage of humans.
Yeah, because it's significant that Noah was a righteous man who was blameless before God. Now, this doesn't necessarily convey the sense of being perfect, but it does mean that he was walking faithfully with Yahweh. Like, God was his God, and he pursued that relationship. And that is not something God is willing to throw away. So
no,
he was wanting to save Noah.
Yeah,
for the great reset.
And it's sort of like that reward of, like, rewarding him with not dying. So it'd probably be remiss to sort of ask if there have been various movies that have come out on this story. One famous one which has tried to dramatically recreate the story. If we've all sort of seen the movie Noah, but then there are other ones where they've taken the story and they've either put a bit of a spin on it. Is it Bruce Almighty or is it
Evan Almighty?
Evan Almighty has taken that story and either put it in this modern context or
I think even one of the Ice Age movies had a Noah's Ark storyline.
I don't remember.
Ice Age, the meltdown was definitely Noah's Ark.
Yeah, that would make sense with the ice caps melting and everything. Yeah. Before we sort of go further into the passage, is there any thoughts and comments on how this story has been depicted in media?
I didn't realize, I think from the kids' Bible that I always talk about and Sunday school and just hearing about the story, I didn't realize how it was such a horrible thing that was happening. I thought it was just like a wholesome, like getting on a boat, like this hope, like saving people and animals and things. Like it was like a nice, happy story. I didn't realize that they were actually escaping something and had to survive. I didn't realize how like sad and like horrible it was.
Yes, story of judgment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times we tend to think that everything is sort of go lucky and happy with the Bible, which because naturally there is hope out of it, right? We're not sort of thinking that everything is dire. We actually come out of like reading the Bible with this sort of hope and this salvation from it. So we should feel sort of like happy with it. But then there's that tendency, especially being like if you've been brought up with Sunday school and everything, that things are a little bit darker, things are a bit more either dire or a bit more gross and yuck, and that things probably were not as you said, Morgan, sort of happy as they may have seen. And yeah, this is an escape story as well. This story here, and it's something that sort of media has sort of portrayed either well or not well. It's sort of back to my point of like the thoughts on it. Whatever the thoughts may think of something like Noah, it's a bit more of a controversial story within the Christian circles, as dramatic as it is. One of the things I think it does do well is showing how dire the situation was and the reasoning for the flood to happen. Now, how it plays out, various rock monsters, various Noah's attitude on the boat probably will have lots of problems with that, and how it is. But I find it always interesting to see how media has portrayed these things, because it's always nice to see stories from the Bible come to life, because it's not part of mainstream media. It's something that's not necessarily so common. So it's always interesting to see what they do with it. But yeah, when different people's interpretations come into play, then that's when we can have issues with it. So I think probably what's important is probably to go, all right, if you've watched any of the movies, take those movies with a grain of salt as we go through this, because it's not an accurate representation, or we need to sort of put our either our biases or what our preconceived notions by like watching media aside as we go into it.
I had a question where it says everything on earth will perish, but then at the bottom it says to keep them alive. Like, why was it 2 of every animal? And how did you know those animals weren't going to kill each other? Because like you wouldn't put a little fluffy bunny in with a giant aggressive, I don't know. What's an aggressive animal?
Like a lion or tiger or something like that.
Yeah, like why did he do that, and how did he know that they weren't going to kill each other?
Well, if you go back to the famous movie Noah with Russell Crowe, God puts all the animals into a deep slumber so that they just sleep on the ark. I don't think we're actually told. I think we're just meant to know that the Lord is Lord over animals as well. And so his idea was 2 of every animal so that life will continue after I destroy the world. But also, interestingly, 7 of all the clean animals, because clean animals are animals that a Jewish person was allowed to eat and was commanded to sacrifice. So you needed more of those animals around.
So it wasn't just 2 by 2. It's a lot to fit on one boat.
It is. When you then include food, unless we assume God sustained the animals in a different way, you also need to fit all the food in. But it is a very big boat.
It is.
Like, if we look at the dimensions, it's 137 meters long, it's 23 meters wide, and it's 14 meters high. Now, I looked up some other boats or ships from different time periods to see what the comparison was. And so, kind of, Egypt, at the height of its power, their biggest ships were probably 50 meters long. In Roman times, their largest vessel that was ever known was probably about 55 meters long, so not much longer than the ancient Egyptians. The United States built the largest wooden boat ever built, and it was 100 meters long. And yet here we have Noah's Ark at 137 meters long. Like, it's longer than any wooden boat ever made. And so it can fit everything in it.
It can.
But it's just insane.
How accurate, like, it was the translations. Do we think that the dimensions were like properly written down, or through sort of our knowledge of sort of the past, through history, is the translations going, it would have been like this, or have we just seen that number in whatever it was written like before and going, okay, that's this number translate to this number in English, if that makes sense?
There's a few translation things in this story that are worth getting into in a moment, but when it comes to the numbers, where we have consistency across all of the ancient manuscripts that these are the numbers recorded. And so we do believe that these are the numbers given. Now, we then have to figure out what to do with that. Someone like John Walton will argue that this is obvious hyperbole, and even the ancient audience would have realized that. Like, that's why the numbers are so big, is because they're meant to recognize it as exaggeration. Early Christian theologian Augustine argued that these were the dimensions of a giant coffin, and then did some teaching along those lines.
Interesting.
However we land on these issues, which we'll probably dive in at the very end, so stay tuned about what we think is actually going on with Noah's flood. I do think we can trust that these are the measurements that were recorded in Genesis.
You would think that almost it's just Noah and his sons building this.
Yes, you would assume so.
Which is quite a feat for 4 people, if it was only 4 people.
I mean, in the Evan Almighty movie, we have all the animals that help build the ark as well.
We do. But then what I always imagined this story as it was only Noah and his family around. And we don't, but which sort of like rightly so, we don't actually get given that there were anyone else there. But there would have been other people there, because sort of maybe looking on and how that sort of would have worked. And I could immediately just imagine that other people sort of watching on would have wanted to go on said boat. Well, one would have thought he was crazy to build this giant boat, but then 2, as the flood was happening, would have wanted to go onto the boat, which is where we sort of then get some imagery from the movie from. But yeah, it's just interesting how I've always thought of this story as Noah and his family was alone, and this all happened. But there would have been other people around, because God's sort of wiping the slate clean.
Well, yeah, there's a whole society around that God is judging. But it would surprise me if Noah employed or paid this huge workforce that then didn't get on the boat.
No, wouldn't be a good boss.
No, not at all. And so I agree. I think as we read the story, we're meant to see it as Noah and his family building this ark with a fair bit of God involvement. We also don't know how long it took them to build it. I don't think that's explicitly said in the text.
No, and numbers, as we'll go through it later, but numbers sort of play a big part in this.
Lots of dates.
Lots of dates, but things took time as well. I think the other misconception I've always had is a lot of this was instantaneous.
Yes.
That, one day he built the ark, the next day the floods happened, and then the next day the floods ceased, and then it was all fine and dandy. But this was a long time, as we will read later. A year goes past, which is a while. especially to be on a boat.
Yes, literally a year on a boat.
Mm.
Now, I said that there would be some translation issues. The word that we see in our text that says cypress wood in the NIV, so make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Actually, let's start with the first. The word ark there actually literally translates to chest, as in like a treasure chest type situation. And so a literal translation is Noah and the chest rather than Noah's ark. But anyway, the more important point is that word cypress wood is not found anywhere else in the Hebrew language ever. So the translation of cypress wood is actually an utter guess. Now, one of the best theories I've heard is that there's another language from the same time frame as the Hebrews, and they have a very similar word, and that word means reeds.
Oh.
Now, if you think about how old this story is, ignoring the fact that Noah's Ark is a giant boat, the only boats they would have been familiar with would have been canoes made out of reeds.
Mm.
And so potentially what we're reading here is make this huge, ridiculously sized ark out of reeds, which is the only thing that people of that time period would have been making boats out of.
Which structurally, a giant boat made out of reeds.
It creates issues more than wood would.
Yeah, I mean, if it was reinforced by tar, then great. But
yeah, that's a good start.
Reeds, though, it adds to that. Well, it's a giant feat in itself, just if it was out of wood, but out of reeds.
Anyway, so that word doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew language. When the first century Jews of Jesus' time came to translate the Old Testament into Greek, they translated that word as square timber. So they instantly assumed it was some type of wood, but they also didn't know what type of wood. So they just assumed as well. But I think there's a fairly decent case to be made that it's a loan word from Akkadian, which means reeds, which just gives a very different look to Noah's Ark.
It does.
Like it's no longer this big square wooden boat. It's this reedy giant canoe.
A giant canoe, yeah. And I think that's one of the, as we've gone through other Matthew, and as we're sort of going through Genesis, just breaking those preconceived notions of what it might look like or what it might have actually been. I think it's great. It really sort of challenges our mainstream thought process of what this all could have been.
Why did God use a flood? Why not a big fire or a cyclone like flood?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think firstly we learn that by bringing a flood, God is sovereign over all of creation. We learn that he can judge the world and use nature to do so. We know that a flood would be an effective way of purging the world. If the purpose of this flood, as is stated in the text, is to wipe out the evil of humanity, then a flood is a really effective way of washing away the evil. But I think the most likely reason why he chose a flood out of every possible thing was that what we see here is almost a perfect parallel to creation itself. And so the very first state of creation, if we remember our first episode, was that it was just a watery mass with the Spirit of God hovering over the watery mass. And so what God does in this is actually decreation. He returns creation to its original state, which is totally covered by water. And then he gets to recreate as the water slowly recedes. It's almost like a recreation process of preparing a new world for take two. And so I think we're meant to look at that metaphor, that analogy of the significance of water in the creation story and see that as the reason why.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful sort of twofold metaphor of taking that step back of creation, going back on itself and then to the recreation. But then also the washing away of sins and that metaphor of washing it away in the rebirth from it. Speaking about the flood and the water itself, is there anything in history that alludes to this sort of happening outside of the Bible?
I was going to delay this conversation to the end. The very short answer is a crazy amount of ancient societies have flood myths, but there's no geological evidence of a flood of this magnitude. But I might delay you a little bit more because I think let's get through the story in the text and then let's discuss the historicity of the story.
I like it. Let's do it. It's great trust that Noah is having with God, and shows Noah's commitment, but also faith and following his commandment. I mean, it just says at the end of chapter 6 here is so Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. Especially there's no. Until the water starts to rise and come from the ground and fall from the sky, there's no real sort of quote-unquote evidence that this is going to happen. And a lot of people could just like dismiss it of, oh, well, whatever, like it's not actually going to happen, or this is just some sort of threat or whatever. But it shows Noah's great sort of devotion to God in following him and trusting that this will happen. Because if Noah didn't, then he's going to get wiped out just like everyone else. It shows great faith.
Yeah, definitely. I think that comes back to this idea of Noah being a blameless man. Like he was the one person, along with his family, left on earth that was still living the way that God desired and in relationship with Yahweh, which is why they are chosen to survive.
Yeah, chosen for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all 8 of them get into this ark that Noah has built, and then the flood happens. The flood hits, and it rains for 40 days straight.
Which I do like this sort of motif of 40 days and 40 nights that is throughout the Bible. It's not just sort of in just one place. The whole idea of 40 days and 40 nights is a common theme that's starting to come up. We're sort of discovering.
Yes, we love some good biblical numbers, and 40 is definitely one of them, as is 7. Like, we see that in here as well.
In verse 21, where it's talking about all the livestock, wild animals and things perishing on earth, I just think, why did all the innocent animals have to die when they weren't the ones that were evil? It was like mankind and humans. Like, I get he couldn't save all the animals, but I just think it's a bit rough. Like, the animals didn't do anything directly.
Yeah, fair. Like, I don't know if I have any good response apart from just like good observation.
Just a thought. I just think it's really rough.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, well, maybe it's the consequence of humans that the consequence of humans have this flow-on effect of affecting other things like animals and the world as well than just ourselves. Because like you're quite right. The animals now get thrown into this and they haven't done anything,
which links in really well with the creation mandate given to humanity of firstly made in God's image to rule over creation, and secondly to be stewards of creation. And mankind has failed at both of them, and creation itself suffers because of it.
Yeah.
And so I think it is really fair to put that all on the evilness of humanity there.
And I also like in 22 that they use the breath of life in its nostrils, like they used in the start of Genesis, the same language.
Yeah, definitely. Which I think is meant to increase the significance of it to us. Like, I think you've picked up something really fair from the text, which is it's trying to labor this point of these were God's creations that he created and brought to life, and now they're being wiped out. So we're meant to feel that.
Yeah.
No, definitely. This would have been such a sort of dramatic time. I'm like sort of thinking of like, well, if I was in this situation, like how would I be feeling? It would just be like, I think all emotions and everything would be all over the shop, because all of a sudden you were living on this earth, and then you've been you've built this boat, and then having to rush into the boat, and then everything has been flooded, and sort of thinking like, what's life come to? How's this sort of like looking? And it's like how bleak it is of just like sort of like looking out at the ocean, and there's nothing there. I mean, I sort of hate the idea of the open ocean, so that doesn't sort of help. But it again through God, like trusting God, because you could be out there on the open water, just like, is any of this going to change? What's going to happen next? But it's through trusting God that, you will get through this. Not to mention, you've got all these animals and everything that you've got to look after. If you're putting yourself in the shoes of Noah.
Yeah, that's a full-time job in and of itself.
Yeah, it's a full-time job. Like if you put yourself in the shoes of like Noah and his wife, you're also looking after the family as well. Yeah, it would have sort of been a bit crazy.
Especially when you do the maths, they are on the boat for 377 days. So they enter the ark in what is effectively late April, and they exit in early May a year later.
I'd hope you get used to the ocean and not being seasick, and like.
I mean, the ark's the size of a cruise liner, so
true. So there'd be a bit of like stabilization, but I'm just imagining sort of walking onto dry land and like having your sea legs. And having to readjust. On a slightly different note, you keep saying Yahweh. Is that because we're sitting in the Old Testament rather than saying God, or is there a specific reason why you're saying
I've
Yahweh?
just been trying to slowly change my language, to be honest, as like a general comment of we're revealed in Scripture the name of our God. And so, yes, I can use his title and keep calling him God. But at the same time, in Exodus, we're told God's very name. And part of me goes, through Jesus, I get to approach the Father. I get to approach God. Like blameless, without blemish. That's what Colossians says. Free of all accusation. And so if God is my heavenly Father, then why not use his name?
No, that's fair.
Anyway, it's just like a slow change I'm making in everyday life, not just in the Old Testament right now.
Yeah. No, I've just noticed that you've been doing that. And so, and just quickly, so is it through Jesus that we're allowed to say Yahweh?
No, I don't think so. I think God reveals his personal name to his people and they were always allowed to use it. The Pharisees / the Jewish nation as a whole, they took the commandment to not use the Lord's name in vain very seriously. And they did the classic thing that we talked about a lot when we looked at Matthew, which is introduced a whole bunch of extra rules to make sure they never broke the one rule. And so to make sure they never used the Lord's name in vain, they made up the extra rule of never say the Lord's name, which is why when you hit the culture of Jesus, no one would ever have said Yahweh because you would have been stoned to death by the Jewish leaders because they'd created these extra rule. But I don't think that's a biblical standard. That's a cultural standard.
That's fair enough. And something I think to clarify, because I think a lot of people will be like, but you like, you were stoned for like uttering that name. So like,
back in the day, sure.
Back in the day,
Doesn't mean that was a right response.
No, and I think that's just breaking down the misconception.
I just had like an epiphany thought. If Noah's family was the original ones left on Earth, does that mean like we're related to Noah? Like we're descendants of Noah?
That's what I've always said. Whenever anyone's like, yeah, we're all related to Adam and Eve, as a kid, I would always be like, yeah, but like we're also all related to Noah. Now, again, towards the end of the episode, we'll get more into where we potentially stand on all of that. But yes, on face value, yes, we're all related to Noah.
Where is Adam and Eve? Did they just die?
Oh, they're long dead. This is like 1,000 years later.
Oh, can't keep up.
Well, because we give the, before Noah, we get given that whole like
that huge genealogy.
Yeah, and this person lived this long and then died and that, and then they give Noah.
Yeah, chapter 5.
Which
Adam lived 800 years. Sorry, Adam lived a total of 930 years and then died. And this is well past that.
Which, speaking of, Noah is now 600 years old. Long time to be alive.
Maybe he needed all of that time just to build this boat.
Yeah, I know, right? 500 of those years to build a boat. To that scale, anyway.
Then we sort of roll into chapter 8 and we see that God remembered Noah. So here's my question. Did God forget Noah?
I don't think he would have forgotten him. I think he just put all his trust in him and left him to it and just felt confident to just let it go for a bit and then came back and remembered, oh, maybe he's doing the right thing. It's probably time to give him a break, cut him some slack.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, Morgan. I don't necessarily think it's like a full forgetting or anything. I when I read that before, I was like, oh, that just must be a linguistic sort of, that's just the way they've written it sort of thing of, just to sort of link, and God will now sort of do this thing. I want to think that God wouldn't forget about Noah. I'd like to think that that's the case.
I mean, I'd like to argue theologically God cannot forget.
Yes.
Just as a starting point. But you're absolutely right, Josh. 8 times in the Old Testament we see this phrase, God remembered. And every time it means that God is about to take an action for that person. And so it's less of God forgot about them, and more of here's a marker in the text that God is about to intervene.
Yeah.
And that's what that phrase means.
Yeah, and if we like sort of put it into sort of like our own context, just to sort of help our thought process on this, like, well, if someone asks you to do something, you can still remember to do it. It's not like you forgot to do whatever task they asked you to do. Just saying that you remember to do it just further emphasizes the point that you knew what to do.
Reading where the floodwaters start to recede and Noah opens the window, I wanted to know if there's a contrast obviously between a raven and a dove. One's like could be considered not a very nice bird and then one's really peaceful. Like, why was that done? Is there meaning behind that?
A raven, my understanding, it's argued that the raven can sort of survive because it was like a scavenger style like type bird, and it would also sort of eat the decaying bodies and stuff. So it wasn't a good indication of whether or not there was land, because if there was any sort of quote unquote meat on the ocean, it could just sort of survive off that and didn't really give an indication of whether or not land was there, where the dove, which was specifically looking for sort of plant life, seeds and branches and all that, it bringing back a branch was the clear indication. So it wouldn't be able to survive out on the open water. So it just possibly could just fly around and then come back to the boat. But then once it found land, it brought back that fig tree. So I think that's my understanding. I think that's the difference between the two. Is the raven can survive off water, so it wouldn't give that clear indication that land was there.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that distinction before. I have no answer to your question, Morgan, apart from thinking about other times doves are used in the Bible. The most famous example is as a image of the Holy Spirit descending upon Jesus. And so there's something about the dove that kind of brought a bit more hope to the situation of once the dove was released. Like they were sure they were almost out of this situation. But I like Josh's explanation. Who knew that Josh was secretly a bird watcher? All this knowledge.
I think this is the only time I've got bird knowledge.
And then we see 7 more days again, the number 7 at the end of that section.
Yep.
He waited another 7 days. They're not in a rush.
No.
Just being absolutely sure.
That's the crazy thing. And like what I said before, I always think of everything happening instantly, but even just the water going down took a long time.
150 days it took for the water to recede.
Oh.
And then another 70 days for it to dry.
Yeah, to dry. Not even water goes down and then step out. No, it's to dry it. Everything to dry up. It's a long time.
If everything on Earth was destroyed when the boat had dried and they were able to leave the boat, because they would have nowhere to live, would they have continued living on the ark?
Great question.
With an open door going in and out? Where would they live?
We have no evidence either way.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume the components of the ark could have been really helpful for starting to rebuild, but who knows?
Possibly. I mean, it's something that's written in sort of sci-fi media where if they were to do a spaceship that's going to go colonize an area, they send the spaceship in the intent of, well, that is going to get deconstructed and in the parts and everything are going to get used. So in a way, Noah's boat also could get used for parts and to build a hut as well. Or they could have just lived in it. Yeah. Though, would you want to live in that place after spending
a year cooped up?
I think I might want to move.
Find a cave somewhere. And then the ark lands on the mountains of Ararat. Now, it's probably important to point out that there is today a mountain known as Mount Ararat, but here it just refers to a mountain range, which is roughly in modern Armenia.
Which is where?
Kind of take Turkey and go a little bit east.
Yep.
Before starting chapter 9, I personally had to Google what a covenant was because I hadn't seen it before, but it's an agreement for those newbies listening.
Yeah, it's probably important to point out because the Bible, you can almost boil down to a series of covenants. And this is the first time we see the word covenant in Scripture, and it's with Noah. Later, we'll see several with Abraham, and then we just keep going forward until we reach the new covenant, which we as Christians are under. And so these are different agreements God makes.
Which is slightly skipping ahead, but it's I've never thought of the Ark of the Covenant being the Ark of Agreement.
Yeah.
I've just always thought of, it's the Ark of the Covenant and that's just a thing. No, that's sort of opened my eyes.
Yeah. And what's really important and special about this covenant with Noah is its kind of universal scope. Because it says in chapter 9 that this is a covenant that includes every living creature, and it is for always. It's perpetual, it's everlasting. And it's also unconditional. Most other covenants that we hit further in the Bible, God will have some conditions from the humans he's talking to agree to, whether it be something as simple as faith. He'll need something from them. But this one is totally unconditional.
Does God have a change of heart here about going, I'll never do something as devastating like this again? Or was this sort of always the plan? We're going to wipe it out and this will be the one time I do a full reset. Or does it not matter,
I don't like the idea of God having a change of heart in the sense of properly changing his mind, because that starts to grade against the normal conception of God. I think what we're meant to see here is it was always the plan to do a big reset with Noah, and now he has his first formal covenant with humanity. And from Noah, he's going to get Abraham. And from then onwards, you start to see a plan really take shape. And so I think it was always part of this plan.
Yeah, the whole reset plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he promises never to destroy the world with a flood again.
So specifically a flood.
I think so, yes, because we know from the New Testament that when we come to the destruction of the world at the end of time, in 2 Peter chapter 3, it will be via fire.
So all those people that were dropping pamphlets out there saying that the next big flood's coming.
Oh, you're wrong.
You're wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
This covenant proves that it was never going to happen.
Yeah, every time you see a rainbow, you should know that it is not going to happen, which is really nice that it's the rainbow that is the sign of this covenant, as a reminder to everyone always that whenever you see a rainbow, there's God's promise not to flood the earth again.
It's not to say that this was the first time a rainbow happened.
No. Rainbows
would have probably been like a consistent thing as it does within our own weather sort of patterns and how that sort of operates. But it's now a symbol that we get to take and go, this is now the agreement, this is now the covenant.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess reading this, I just was looking at where it says be fruitful, increase in number and fill the earth. If it was just one family, like that's a lot of pressure, and obviously like gaining population and getting bigger numbers of people would be quite slow. Like it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to delay your question to next episode.
Oh.
And here's why.
No.
I think the theme of chapter 10, which we're not covering today, is refilling the earth. Like it's the repopulation of the earth is the theme of chapter 10. And so I'm going to delay your question or insight or whatever other word we want to use and say, we'll talk about it next week, promise.
All right, well, I have another question then.
Yeah, go.
You're not going to answer that one. In verse 4 of chapter 9, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. Does that mean they're vegetarians?
That is a great question. So this is the first time in Scripture that God gives permission to humanity to eat meat. Like before this moment, in Genesis, he says, I give you every seed-bearing plant in the early chapters. This is the first time he explicitly says you are allowed to eat meat as long as you drain the blood. Now, we do know that someone like Abel was a keeper of sheep. Like we know he was a shepherd. So I think there is an implicit assumption that humans had been doing this anyway.
Yeah, that was my thought.
But now it's explicit. You're allowed to, as long as you drain the blood, which is actually a law that we see repeated several times in other places in the Old Testament. But also we also see it in the New Testament. In Acts 15:29, we see the New Testament church agree that, hey, we don't need all of these new Christians to follow all of the Jewish laws. That's too much of a burden. But they should probably still drain the meat of blood before they eat it.
Is that maybe like doing it in a humane way, if that makes sense? So like possibly like what we were saying before, people were still eating animals, but it could have been in a non-humane way, but like God's giving permission.
Maybe. I think it's more trying to really highlight the significance of blood. Like we read elsewhere in the Bible that there's life in the blood. Like that the whole conception of how life works in a biblical worldview is via the blood. And that will therefore be used for several really important doctrines in Christianity going forward and Judaism going forward.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just starting to highlight the importance of blood.
Yeah, because it's almost, in a way for me, it's implying that like, well, okay, so drain the lifeblood. Okay, so the animal's fully dead.
Fully dead, yes.
It almost implies that they were eating animals that were not fully dead.
Yeah.
In a really sort of horrific way.
Well, we might leave the rest of chapter 9 for next time, just because we're running short on time, and I very, very much want to cover this question of the historicity of the flood. So in other words, is this a real historical event of the entire world being flooded? Interested in your thoughts.
On one hand, I go yes, because this is our Bible, this is our book, this is, like, as Christians, this is our history. On the other hand, I'm like, well, I know that the Bible is written in different styles, so this could be some sort of poetic way of writing, though there's a part of me that doesn't think so, because it's so very specific in what it's saying here.
Down to dates, yeah.
Yeah, down to the dates, measurements of the boat and everything. Then my brain also goes, well, the Earth did have an ice age and that ice age ended, so maybe there's some linkage there when, everything melted, just like in the Ice Age movie. It's like, is there something there? But yeah, for me, I don't know much about like if it sits in history or whether. I've seen a couple of YouTube videos. Haven't actually really watched them, but I've seen a couple of YouTube videos that have tried to prove it. Your thoughts, Morgan, on that?
I don't know. I think big natural disaster, yeah. but it just seems very unrealistic.
Yeah.
Fair.
I just don't see bad animals and savage animals getting on with these humans for that long on a boat, and it just doesn't seem very realistic to me.
I mean, we always have to remember that we are reading stories about God here, and so we can sometimes just totally dismiss all claims of realism in the sense of God can do anything he wants. And if this is what he wanted to happen as an event in human history, every objection we have could be pretty simply solved. I'm similar to you, Josh, in the sense of I've never put a lot of thought into this story until this past week.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't come on the podcast as the expert and not have well thought out things. But until then, I had never put any time into thinking what was going on here in an early chapter of Genesis, in a story that is so far removed from Jesus, the foundation of my faith, that I just hadn't spent time on it. But let me tell you where I'm currently at. And then I've got 8 points to walk us through to maybe lead you to the same conclusion. So here's my view. It's also the same view as John Walton in his book, The Lost World of the Flood. Go have a read of it. If you don't want to read it, then I know John Dixon in his podcast, Undeceptions, had John Walton on as a guest not that long ago. Also worth listening to. Here's the view. The biblical flood story uses hyperbole to picture a local flood as a worldwide flood to communicate an important theological message. So that's, I think, where I'm sitting right now in terms of my view of the flood. Let me walk through my 8 points of leading us maybe to the same conclusion. Point number 1, Genesis makes claims about real events in a real past. We talked in our first episode about genre, and I made the claim that from Genesis 2 onwards, it's very much just a historical recount, and the genre doesn't change between this story of Noah and the story of Abraham too much. Like it seems to be just giving us history. So point 1 is Genesis is making claims about history. My second point is that in these chapters, Genesis does depict the flood as a global event. So I don't think the Christian explanation of it just being a local flood is quite enough, because it literally says that the water covered the tallest mountain. There is no local flood in history that got that tall. It also doesn't fit thematically. Like the theme of this section is God was so angry with the sin of humanity, he wanted to wipe them out. There's no point in human history where all of humans lived in one small area that a local flood would have done the job. If it was a local flood, why did the birds need to be on the ark? Because I'm sure they lived further afield than wherever this local flood was happening. I just think when you read this story, we do get the image of a global flood, and there's no way around it. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, geology does not support a worldwide flood, and flood stories from around the world do not prove a worldwide flood. Now, floods are so common in the world that there's a reason why almost every ancient culture has a flood narrative, because they're just so common. But there is no scientific evidence that is convincing enough to show that there was a worldwide flood. Here's a quote by Stephen O. Moshier. The worldwide scientific community overwhelmingly rejects the geological interpretation of the flood geologists. So those are the people making those YouTube videos that you've seen, Josh, is here's the evidence for the flood.
Yes.
Facebook yesterday literally suggested a group to me that was the flood was a real event. And I was like, why am I getting this suggested?
That's funny. It knows.
Yeah. There is no convincing scientific case that there was a worldwide flood. In fact, we often see the opposite.
So we've got, so sort of just to, on one hand, the text is explicitly saying this is a worldwide event.
Yes.
But from a geological, historical, just how the planet works point of view, it's just impossible for that to happen.
Yes. That's where we're currently sitting after my 3rd point. Here's my 4th point. The Bible often uses hyperbole to describe historical events. Let's stay in the book of Genesis for a second. Genesis 49 verse 57. All the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. Now that same phrase, all the earth, is used here in the Genesis account of all the earth was covered with water. But do we believe that in the time of Joseph, so about 2000 BC, that Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals in 2000 BC travelled to Egypt to collect grain to take back to the Americas or take back to Australia because the whole world was in famine? I would suspect that not even people who fight fiercely for the historicity of a global flood would agree on that point. Joshua 1-12 pictures the total and utter annihilation of the Canaanites in the Promised Land. However, the second half of that book pictures Israelite living with Canaanites. And so again, we see hyperbole.
Yeah.
Even Jesus uses hyperbole when he says the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, because that's not strictly the truth.
No.
The orchard seed is smaller. And so I think it's fair to say, as a literary technique, the biblical authors will often use hyperbole. Now, that leads me to my fifth point. Genesis presents a hyperbolic account of the flood. Now, some people may claim that this is lying, but if my wife tries to pick up a bag and says, wow, that weighs a ton, I know she's using hyperbole. It's not a lie in any sense of the word, because she's making a point by what she's saying. Her point is that this is insanely heavy. Why have you packed the bag this way, Lachlan? In the same way that ancient people potentially recognized that this was a hyperbolic account. And because they recognize the exaggeration going on, it doesn't make it a lie or doesn't make it false. And so that is what I want to say about point 5. Josh, Morgan, comments as I slowly work through these 8 points.
I think it's like previous things we've talked about with these points you give us. Like, I don't want to overthink it, because now I'm just really overthinking it all.
Yeah, fair.
That's true. And you also want to get like that full picture for like sort of making any
a final
judgment.
comment.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me go through the rest of the points and then we'll get your thoughts. Point number 6. The flood story has a real local flood behind it. If this is a hyperbolic account, there's still a real flood somewhere. One option given is something Josh mentioned before, which is 10,000 BC, which is the end of the last ice age. That's totally an option. I don't think that lines up with my view of Adam being a Middle Eastern farmer, but that's an option. We have other ancient accounts of a flood, which happened in about 3000 BC. So the Sumerian king list mentions a big flood taking place in about 3000 BC, but we don't have any evidence of a flood big enough in that time period that would probably be the basis of this type of story. I think the most compelling case for what local flood might have been the case is presented by William Ryan and Walter Pittman, who are both scientists, and they've suggested in 5600 BC. So you know where the Black Sea currently is? Picture the world map in your mind, the Black Sea just above Turkey. That used to be a freshwater lake. That used to be a smallish freshwater lake. In about 5600 BC, floodwaters smashed through basically where Istanbul is today, smashed through there and turned what that saltwater lake was into the Black Sea we know today. Now, that event was devastating. Like, any humans that lived near the shore of this previously existing freshwater lake would have been flooded out. The levels in that area would have risen hugely, and that whole area is no longer good, fertile land with a fresh water source nearby. It's now salt water. And so there was this huge geological event in 5600 BC, and it's just close enough to the Middle East to sort of explain what could be the basis for the Noah's story. Especially since when you think about where Noah's Ark landed, in the Ararat Mountains. It's in that area. And so I think that is potentially a really, really good option.
And if you lived there and that's all you knew, your entire world would be crumbling down.
If not thousands of deaths. Like, many, many people would have died when that flood happened. And the only way to survive was to go to higher land, but your old place of living was no longer habitable. Pretty huge event. Here's my point 7. This local flood is intentionally described as a global flood for rhetorical purposes and theological reasons. I'm going to jump straight to point 8 from there, which is, here's those theological reasons. The theological reasons are, every story up until this point in Genesis has been showing that humans are sinners, that God judges sinners, but God remains gracious towards his sinful creatures. Like, there's this pattern of sin and judgment, but also grace happening. We also see in this story divine presence, the establishment of order, how order is undermined. We see that the flood narrative points at God's power and freedom over creation, his deadly anger over sin, and also his gracious redemption in light of judgment. The only other point I'll say about theological purposes is, just from the Middle East, we have several other flood stories. And by looking at the differences between those flood stories and the one we have in the Bible, we can also see some of the different theological points that are probably trying to be explained by recording their own version of a flood story. And this is, in all of the other flood stories, there are many gods involved. We have the one Yahweh involved. In the other flood stories, the gods come across as flawed in both their motivations and their actions, whereas Yahweh is perfect. The reason for the flood in these other flood stories is because of the noise of mankind. Like, they're just annoying the gods. But in this version, it's because they are evil. After the flood, in all of the flood stories, the hero always offers a sacrifice. In the pagan flood stories of that same time, the gods are starving because they feed off human sacrifices. And it sort of shows their stupidity in wiping humans out, so they kind of swarm the sacrifice. Whereas Noah's sacrifice is the beginning of this brand new covenant. It's the first moment of this covenant between God and man. Those are my 8 points, which hopefully lead up to the main point, which is that I think the biblical flood story uses hyperbole to picture a local flood as a worldwide flood to communicate important theological messages. Whew. Okay, to the table. I've said a lot of words.
There's a lot to think about there.
I think after hearing all of that, like I said before, I'm like overthinking it. But now looking back on it, it's hard to imagine a global flood. Like I didn't really think about the whole world flooding. Like I think I just thought of it as like just a lake going up. But trying to think about the whole world flooding at one time confuses me after hearing all that. So I'm not really sure where I sit with it, but I don't know. I have no idea.
Fair.
I'm just confused now.
Josh, your
All
thoughts?
right.
I know I went through a lot there and very fast.
Yeah, it's similar to Morgan, like sort of saying you sort of like don't know what to sort of think, and it's sort of you try not to overthink it. Because on one hand you're like, yeah, like how does a global flood make sense? But my initial thoughts was I don't like it. I don't like it. I would prefer to sit in the place of like it was a global flood, and that might just be my like I don't know dramatic sort of like storytelling creative brain of like wanting it to be this big thing, which I think is fine in my head to be, but also to on the flip side to also think about the history of it and how it sits in our own history and our understanding of how the world works. So on one hand, I'm like, I think it's twofold. On one hand, I'm like, I completely get the story, but on the other hand, it's like I do understand how it works in our world, and it could just be hyperbole and sort of emphasizing a point. And as we've said before, I think the main takeaway is the God resetting. It's the message that's coming out of it, not to get so hung up on was there a global flood, was there, wasn't there, like, and really sort of like getting into the nitty gritty of that, of more just sitting in the place of God's resetting the world, but more importantly, God's giving this new covenant to his people. And that's the real takeaway point, if that makes sense. If you were sort of, still struggling on and that overthinking of like, okay, well, does this change everything about the story? Like, where do we sit? Do we, like, how much do I now believe of this story? It's like, well, if anything, just take away God's covenant, God's promise, God's agreement with us. Because that's, I think, the main point.
Yeah. It's an exceptionally important part of the story. My only encouragement to you is grab a copy of John Walton's book.
Yeah.
Read it yourself rather than my insanely fast summary that I just went through just then, because I found it quite a convincing read.
Yeah. No, that'd be quite interesting to delve into, and it's something I've never, and I'm sure everyone else has never sort of, and Morgan just said, like, I think we just don't question it. Not that we always should question it in saying that, but growing up with it, you're like, yep, flood happened, and we move on to the next story. Like, this is the point of the podcast. It's quite interesting to delve into it and get that better understanding of it. And if it was sort of the Black Sea, sort of, this is where it happened, yeah, I can understand that everyone living there, this would have changed their entire life. Like, this would have been world ending for them. And if this was written from those people living there, from their perspectives, yeah, your entire world is ending right there.
Yep, absolutely. This is definitely one of those things that I hold loosely. Like, I'm trying my best to figure out what God is teaching in his word, and trying to figure out how that works with all the other sources of information that God gives us. And this is where I'm at. But yeah, definitely holding it loosely and focusing on what we learn through Noah as a character.
Yes.
Because ultimately it is the teaching of the Bible that's inspired, not the event that happened that's inspired.
It's showing Noah's character, but also God's character.
Yes.
I think my takeaway from today is that I had a different perception of what Noah's Ark was in the story. Like I said before, I thought it was really hopeful and like a nicer story than what it was. So I've just been shocked by how dire it was and what it would have actually been like. And I also didn't realize that it was just Noah's family at the time. I thought there was a lot more people before I'd read this. I just assumed it was like God saved all the good people, not just Noah's family. So that's probably my takeaway.
According to the text, Noah's family was all the good people.
Yeah, but just like the amount of people, I'd always thought it was a lot more people on the boat than just them.
Mm.
So I think like my takeaways from other bits that we read, just to not have these perceptions before actually looking into it.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
My takeaway from the text has been said multiple times throughout this episode, which is that the flood was God's anger at sin.
Mm.
And I don't think we, as Christians here today in the 21st century, take sin seriously enough.
Mm.
I think we sin all the time and we're like, what? There was no negative consequences I can see from that.
Mm.
But sin is sort of like firing a gun into a dark room. You can't see the damage you're doing, but God can see it, and he hates the damage that you're doing.
Mm.
And so I'm just really walking away with the message of God hates sin. He will judge it. And like, look at the lengths he went to judge it here.
Mm. Definitely.
Which is, quite a negative takeaway point. But I think that's like, it's a negative story.
Yeah. No, it's not a pretty story, but it's something important to remember.
Mm.
Like what we said of like the preconceived notions of like everything being airy-fairy and nice. It's like, well, sin isn't.
No.
And committing it isn't as well. And we should heed the warnings and follow through with not committing any sins because we know what the consequences are. We have the examples all laid out for us. The flip side for my takeaway is to what you're saying, Lucky, is again, as it was similar last week, but again is God's mercy in all this as well. God could have just swept Noah up on all of this and went, this is the clean slate. But he still was able to give mercy to those devoted to him, to the quote unquote good, people here. He saved Noah and his family for being those committed followers, for walking in fellowship with God. And then, as we see at the end of the story, the agreement and the covenant that God gives, God shows his mercy there as well. And I think it's just nice to see that that there is consequences with God, and he will take those actions, but he will reward you with his mercy as well. So for everyone at home, for when this gets released, it will just be right before Easter, right before Good Friday, right before Easter, which is a significant event in our Christian calendar. It is, I think, probably the event. It's the reason. It's the reason why our faith is alive. So if you haven't listened to it already, go back to our Matthew series. Then that's where we cover the Easter story, the Good Friday story. We cover Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection, and him taking the sins for us and everything there. So I wish everyone a happy Easter, whatever you're doing. And if you're interested into knowing more about the Easter story, go back to Matthew and discover it there. Like always, make sure you keep up to date with our social medias, Facebook, Instagram. We post, we try to post regularly there. Forgive us if we're not always regularly posting, but we'll post updates there. And we've got a Patreon. So if you want to support us, as we've said each week, if you want to support us financially, follow us on Patreon. You get a couple of different exclusive things, extra long episodes, and parts of podcasts that we've cut out that we've just can't fit in the full episode, so that we're going to put them in as a separate thing. You'll find them on Patreon. So follow, just go to the link tree to get more details, and if you want to support us on Patreon there. If you're listening to the podcast and you want to see our lovely faces, then you can go head on to YouTube and you can see the video format of the podcast. Or if you're watching us on YouTube and you just want to listen to us, then this podcast can be consumed on any podcast platform of your choice.
I'll just jump in there, Josh, because I was chatting to a friend at church who exclusively listens to us as a podcast, but went and subscribed to us on YouTube because that actually really helps us. And so if you are just a podcast listener, please still jump on YouTube and subscribe. That is actually really helpful for us as we continue trying to get this podcast out there.
It is, and further to that, share it with a friend. Share this podcast around. We want you to be able to see it grow. And if there's someone out there that you think might benefit, share it with them. And leave a comment, leave a review, send us a message. We'd love to see your thoughts. We'd love to know your thoughts on Noah and what you got from the story, and what you think about, was it a global flood? Wasn't it a global flood? Send in your thoughts. We'd love to hear it. Lockie, can you just end with a word of prayer for us?
Absolutely. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your grace and your mercy. We thank you that has always been in your character. We even see your grace and mercy in saving Noah from your just judgment. And so I pray as we continue going forward from this moment that we'll all continue reading and trying to truly understand your word and seeing your good character come through it all. Pray that in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. Lockie and Morgan, thank you. And we'll see everyone next week. Bye.
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 A Mustard Seed Creative production.